Thank you for coming to hear a talk about type. It's great to see a room full of people willing to come and hear what can be a very dry subject. I hope I can make it otherwise. I'll give you a little background about myself before I start here. I'm a veteran freelance reporter. I've got a deep history with typesetting, printing, and graphic design, and tonight the talk is focused on the history of type and printing in London, but told through its historical archives. So, we could talk about type in London in all sorts of ways, and this is kind of a one angle in. I think there's probably three other talks that you could hear about it that would barely overlap. There's little that survives in London of its typographic past. So when you walk through the city today, you only see little vestiges of it, and I will talk about that as well. So I could take you through parts of the past and show you some photos of the past, but a lot of what we're seeing is it's almost, there was a war. I realize London was bombed, but it's not so much that. It was economic change that caused most of London's history to disappear related to type and printing. This talk has an overlap with the book, so I will show you a lot more imagery in the talk through the slides than I could in the book, because the book is, I want to make a wee tiny little book. I want it bigger than I planned, and I can only squeeze so much in there. So I have hundreds of additional photos. You won't see all of them tonight that I wanted to share. So I have a little roadmap for the talk if you want to pace yourself, and I need to pace myself. It's got 5 parts, and some of them are very brief, and 2 of them are longer. So we're starting with a brief introduction to letterpress for those who don't have a background in letterpress, and the type that was used to print on letterpresses. Some historical background to printing in London, and a little bit about the 2 institutions that I'm going to talk about in depth. Then about the St. Bride Printing Library, then about the Type Archive, and then places to visit and things to do that are type-related in London, and a few book recommendations. So as I say, that sounds like a lot. Most of this is pretty short. The archives are the middle part, and it's the best photos as well. Okay, so I used to set type on this thing, if you can see it. This took 8-inch floppy disks. It's a photo typesetting system that's a combination of digital and optical type. And I learned how to typeset late in high school, and I typeset through college to help offset the cost of school. And it was a great profession, but typesetting effectively disappeared by the early 1990s. I later became a journalist, and I apparently like to collect obsolete professions. This is my profession joke. I guess I need to go into buggy whips next or something, but I think those may be more useful. I've studied graphic design as well, and I've erratically designed work ever since, although I mostly work as a freelance reporter. Coordinating 2 things here. I'm rubbing my belly and my head at the same time. I only had a little exposure to letterpress printing back when I was a typesetter, because its time had already come and gone. It seemed like letterpress was the dominant style of printing from Gutenberg through the mid-1900s. It's a relief method, which I'll explain in a minute with an illustration, in which raised type and engraving is inked and directly contacts paper. And in the 1980s, when I was in college and working as a typesetter and learning something about printing, letterpress was dying. The future was offset printing, digital design. I thought all the letterpress equipment would wind up in the dump, and a lot did. Fortunately, not all of it did. There's individuals, collections, museums around the world that have retained and collected a tiny part of the massive amount of equipment that was used to make things for relief printing. And the results of that making, and that includes things like foundry type, hot metal typesetting machines, and the letterpresses themselves. And I will show you some photos here in a moment. And a number of people preserved the art of letterpress. They taught apprentices. The light was passed on. Thousands of presses still exist in the United States and more worldwide. Some are just a single person's hobby press, and others are being used in commercial operations. There are hundreds of schools worldwide that have letterpress programs as part of their design and art programs. And this astonished me, because I thought it was a very small phenomenon, but it's partly because letterpress went away and then it came back. So even in London, I heard all these stories about, I think one school just recently reopened its letterpress, where the equipment was put in storage, it was sold, it was gotten rid of, and then years went by and they said, gosh, it would be great if we taught this. And sure enough, they had something in a basement, in a storage facility somewhere, or they acquired it from somebody selling off their collection as they retired or moved. So letterpress is actually quite prevalent, or surprisingly prevalent, in art schools. And I spent 2017 as the designer in residence at the School of Visual Concepts, and not only did I learn much more about how to print, which I had very thin knowledge about, but I also researched and wrote a lot of articles for a number of publications about the history and present time of letterpress, type design, and other topics. And that's what led me to London, and that's what my book is about. So enough about me. So in the first part, I'm going to do a quick run through. Who knows how letterpress printing works? I know two people do over there, but okay, good. I'm going to tell you. You just turn off your ears for a moment. I got to tell you a few things. So this is just a little background. This is how printing, essentially, almost all printing, any kind of mass printing that went on, especially for words, not always images, for about 500 years. This is the dominant method, was letterpress, and it's a oops, and it's a little hard to see in this illustration. You can see this is from a great book from the 1940s I found, written by the New York Times head of production, and it was really about printing commercially, and it was a wonderful book that's full of all of this information about what the state of the art was in like 1945, and then everything changed at that point. So this illustration shows from left to right, it's the three printing methods. It's relief, where you see it's raised, so ink is put on that raised surface, paper's pressed into it. The middle is intaglio, or intaglio, depending on how you pronounce it. It's subsurface. Ink is forced into grooves, and then you put paper on top of it. It's almost a capillary action that pulls it off. It's how most postage stamps are printed today still. And the third on the far right is planographic, which is it's a flat surface that has areas that are coated to accept or reject ink, and you kind of a system kind of rubs ink over it, and paper gets rolled onto, or a rubber mat gets rolled onto it, gets rolled onto paper. So there's no contact. It's almost a contactless system that relies entirely on photographic properties. So, and that's really, offset lithography is the dominant method of printing, unless you count xerography or photocopying, which has risen enormously in recent years too, because you can print good books now with photocopying. And xerography is another kind of essentially planographic method. Okay, so type is what you want to hear more about. So these are the three primary kinds of type. And again, you can't see these well, but I can, there's more resources, but this is just to give you a general idea as I go into the slides about the institutions, so you know a little more of what you're seeing. On the far left is an example of hand cast type. And this is how all type was originally made in printing shops from Gutenberg. He somehow, in a fit of genius, over a few decades, ostensibly, that's what we think, developed a method of creating multiple pieces of type from the same form. So you would take a mold and be able to produce piece after piece after piece of essentially interchangeable type. That was part of his genius, and it's still being practiced today. That's a photo I took at the UW at the Book Arts Guild. I'm forgetting the name of the association. Then they had a fellow up from Portland, who is a poet and part of the C.C. Stern type founding museum there, and he was just demonstrating a technique with some modern equipment, like a little heater for the lead, of casting metal type a piece at a time in 2017. This was last year. I haven't forgotten what year it is yet. For centuries, this was really the only way to make type, was a piece at a time, with somebody pouring, and not with a nice asbestos glove, pouring lead into a mold and getting scalded and so forth. And that's how millions and millions and millions of pieces of type were made. And it was a little bit of a cottage industry. Things start to industrialize, and it starts to transition to foundry-made type. So great factories, sadly with small children working in them, because their little hands work so well with the type, would make type still essentially a piece at a time, but they could gang it up. So they would cast a bunch of the same letter in a form so that they can make a bunch at the same time, but you're still making single pieces of type for being set by hand. Then in the middle here, you're seeing, sort of hard to see what it is. I'll show you more pictures later that are better. These are linotype matrices. The cold type, foundry type, this piece at a time type era ends, not entirely, but largely in the 1880s with the introduction of hot metal typesetting, where someone sits at a keyboard and these things fly down, or papers punch. This is crazy. I'll show you the paper punching thing. And a type is assembled from typing, and then hot metal pours into molds that then produce a bunch of type at once. And it speeds things up 10 to 20-fold. And it also means that the whole world changes. Everything gets faster. It's why suddenly you have an explosion of newspapers. Newspapers get larger. All kinds of simultaneous innovations happening all in the late 1800s, after the Industrial Revolution's been kicking around for a while. So third, on the far right, is a wood type, and this was used typically for large sizes of type that were difficult or impossible to cast in metal, because big pieces of metal tend to cool unevenly, and so you can't get a flat surface on them, and also super heavy. Try picking up a piece of lead this big and carrying it around. It's not so easy. So techniques to create good, solid wood type were developed, and it's used often in advertising, in transportation. So you use big wood type to print signs for, say, the London Underground and things like that, and also for store signage, because there used to be an enormous number of hand lettering sign hand lettering artisans. You know, it was just a job, and people in a town, it could be a bunch of people, all they did was letter signs. That was their full-time position, and that obviously also was replaced by a lot of different techniques of printing, and wood type is one of the aspects that changed that. So each of these kinds of type were sort of separate lines of industry, and they all fed the needs of printers and publishers. And that was from small job shops that could be a hole in the wall with one press producing like little business cards and stationery, to book publishers, to the largest newspapers. And this is what one kind of letterpress looks like. It's a little hard to explain without video and illustration. This is an iron hand press, so it's an improvement on the wooden frame presses that were used up until it became possible to cast large pieces of iron in, I think, the late 1700s. Before that, everything, you know, you had these wood forms, almost like equipment used to weave, same kind of effect. And so iron hand presses could produce more quantity, more solid impression. You could use different kinds of paper. It accelerated, again, the production, but it's still a hand process. You had to put the type on the bottom and use this thing called a frisket over paper and get it in and slide it in and then pull the thing and pull it out. You know, you're inking it by hand with these big ink balls that are pounding on the type to cover them with ink. And it's a whole process. So this is still going on even into the 1800s, before printing starts to speed up. Here's a letterpress, a modern style letterpress. It may not look like it's a letterpress because you think of them as being old and funky and Ben Franklin if you're not used to the modern ones. This is Phil Abel. I'm sneaking in an advanced picture of London here. He's a printer in London who still runs a commercial letterpress. He's had to move 3 times in the last 7 years because, like Seattle, real estate in London is very expensive. I went to the wrong office to meet him, and I thought, this is not a little letterpress shop. This is a skyscraper. And I suspect I have the wrong address. And in fact, I did. That building had been torn down, replaced by a much larger one. So this is kind of what happened commercially towards the end of letterpress's life. You get big industrial machines that look thoroughly modern. So many of these, well, I shouldn't say that, many of them are still in use. I don't know how many compared to the ones that were used originally, but they're still very effective for certain kinds of printing operations. And there still are people who want to print on letterpress, and this is a way to do it. It's automated, it's got a motor, it's electrical. It was the future of letterpress until there was no more future. And then this is phototype. It's one kind of phototype. It's really like a film strip with letters reversed out. You exposed a high intensity laser or light beam controlled by a computer would expose light as the thing spun around like mad onto paper, and you develop it, and you had flat paper, rosin-coated paper, and that was your typesetting. You no longer needed all this metal. And at some point, these different industries converge, so offset printing becomes more viable as a printing method as photographic processes and metallurgy improves. Phototypesetting started in, I think, the 1920s, but it was this weak little field, and it gets better and better. And finally, it's like, oh my goodness, we could throw out all this other stuff, and we don't need metal and lead and all this toxic whatever. We could just be doing everything essentially with light. And this is the last part. These are printing plates, offset printing plates. They're completely flat. You can see the parts that were printed. This is a 4-color process, so there are different inks that have been printed on each plate. Use 4 colors combined to get a full color. And these are just big metal plates. They wrap around a press, and they're flexible, and they go through, the paper goes through pass after pass after pass, and it's the ultimate conclusion. So I'm showing you all this because now we're going to take you back into the past and show it to you. If you're interested in more about the transition, which I'm passionately interested in because I lived through it and worked through parts of it, the transition from the metal era and letterpress to the modern era, there's a movie called Graphic Means, which I don't know if it's still, I don't think it's out yet. It was touring last year, and I think they're still touring it a bit. It'll eventually be available as a digital download and maybe streaming. And it's basically like the total tumult that happened in the breaking down of unions and all this. A very interesting film, and it focuses on the phototype era between metal and digital. So 5 centuries of an approach to printing, ever more industrialized, ever larger, come abruptly to an end. The vast majority of type and presses, all the equipment in factories used to make that They were all scrapped and thrown in the trash. The end. And I walk off the stage like, oh no, wait, there's more. Not everything was lost, and that's the good news. And there's some argument about how much do you need to preserve the past, and the answer is a fair amount. And fortunately, I feel like just enough was saved, just enough was forgotten, and is stuck in warehouses still, and can be revived, that we still have the semblance of history. So part two. See, I told you some of the parts would be short. So some background on English printing history in particular, just for some more context. Excuse me. This is a map around Fleet Street, and I'll tell you why that's important. Gutenberg more or less invented printing as we know it around 1450, and I wrote an article about I wrote a sort of series about the history of printing last summer, and I was shocked. The more I read about Gutenberg, the more primary sources I read, the further back in time, and reading contemporary research where they've learned more about him than they knew. You know, there's more known about Gutenberg now than 100 years ago or 200 years ago, because the research techniques and sharing is better. It is extraordinary the number of different things he put together. But as I say, the main piece that he invented was the ability to cast individual pieces of type, the movable part, that were nearly identical and interchangeable. But he also had to improve ink. He had to figure out how to print paper. He had to make a press. He had to understand not how to bind books, but how to work with this new approach. Everything. How do you design type? No one designed type before Gutenberg. You just had hands and you wrote in different kinds of lettering. So there is some debate about how much he invented, but he clearly invented quite a lot of it based on the historical record, including lawsuits. That guy got sued a lot. He ran off and refused to marry somebody. He didn't pay some workmen. He went bankrupt, but there's disputes. So we know most of what we know about Gutenberg's life from the great records that courts keep. So printing, 1450, roughly when the modern printing era starts. By 1470, you have already people duplicating this idea, because it's that incredible thing. Once someone says to you, if you're an artisan, if you have crafts and you know how to build things and you know some metallurgy, and they say, hey, here's how you print something, your head probably exploded. And you said, oh, of course. And you build a press. And maybe it's not great, but you find some people traveling the countryside who worked in Gutenberg's shop, and they say, well, we'll help you build your press. So it starts to spread in Europe, and you wind up with hundreds of presses by the end of the 1400s. But in 1470, William Caxton who had learned to print somebody corrected me in the book. In the book, I say the Netherlands. I'm not going to go into the technical details. He learned to print in Bruges, which was sort of part of the Netherlands there. I read the history the other day, and I'm like, this would be another hour lecture. So he was in Bruges, in what is now Belgium, and he learned to print. He brought it back to printing, and he's seen William Caxton is the man who brought printing to England. He's celebrated for that. He also printed it really well. Just like Gutenberg, these are some of the first books ever printed. And you think, how did you develop not only all this technique, but create things that were so beautiful and lasting? And I have some pictures from St. Bride Library of some Caxton work. And just looking at it in person took my breath away, and I think it holds up in photos as well. So Caxton died around 1491 at a ripe age at that time, about maybe his late 60s. His assistant or his colleague, depending on sources, who was either German, Alsatian, or Dutch, again, depending on sources, he returned with him from Europe, Wynken de Worde, and you will see this name around. You'll see Wynken, W-Y-N-K-E-N, or sometimes you wonder what it's about. He was the person who developed printing in England, because Caxton died after not that long. So Wynken de Worde took over Caxton's shop, and he relocated the operations from Westminster, which is still kind of a separate city, to Fleet Street at Shoe Lane. And if you look, I don't have a laser pointer, but if you look where that arrow points, that's his symbol. There's a tiny sun you can't see. That's his mark. And that is Shoe Lane. And it is right across the street from the St. Bride Church, where there was a literal bride's well. And that's important because Henry VIII built at the bottom, if you look at almost the bottom right, that's the Bridewell Palace, named for the bride's well, named for St. Bride Church. And so de Worde lived till nearly 80, which I think is another great ripe age. Clearly, even if you're working with lead and all these terrible toxins, it's got to be good for you, apparently, to live that long in those days. But so he established this heart of printing in London in Fleet Street, and for over 500 years, that remained true. So from 1491 until not that long ago, that was where printing lived. And interestingly, de Worde apparently I've been trying to track this down a little more. There's no contemporary accounts, but he literally had his shop in the courtyard of the church. And I've been to the church, and I can't quite picture how that worked. But a lot of people, I guess artisans, did have shops in church courtyards or adjacent to them. So he had kind of a shop and lived nearby, but they printed there, and I don't quite get that. But Fleet Street was also where, in and around Fleet Street, in what is now the City of London, the square mile, which is like 1.3 square miles. That's where the courts of law were, the banks, a lot of financial institutions, most of them still remain there. That's still the heart of the financial, or it remains, I think, largely so. It's changed a little bit, but for most of this time, and there's a notion that because all these functions required printing, sometimes very quick printing, that printing and finance and law all went hand in hand. Now, government functions were further west in Westminster, so those apparently they required a lot of paper too, but not as urgently as all these people printing legal judgments out. And newspapers clustered around government, finance, and law. Fleet Street, because printing was a disreputable profession for whatever reason, so Fleet Street became populated with periodicals. They ran their presses day and night. All those presses needed type. So there's a remarkable book. This is a page from it called Founders London A to Z. It was published in 1998 in a very limited edition keepsake. Fortunately, someone digitized it, and I point it to the URL here. It's bit.ly/founders A to Z, all one word. And I can provide that URL later if you're interested. But this book was printed to celebrate the typeface ITC Founders Caslon, and it was distributed to a few typographic associations in London and internationally, and it locates by address just the type founding operations in London. So not even the printers. There would be too many printers to even mention. This is just places making type. And none of the operations in the book remain. I looked through it, and even by the time the book was printed in 1998, it was like, well, this used to be here and it's gone. This is 20 years ago. So really, the only thing that's left is St. Bride Foundation, which we'll get into, and a few buildings that you can spot, but they have nothing like what was there before. There is no type founding in the city. So this is a later image. This is this is from about I put a date up there, 1895 to 1896. So printing had an apprentice and master system that was retained from the Guild days. But by the end of the 19th century, it was clear among English printers and publishers that they needed some kind of more formal system to churn out more printers, because you have this increased pace of everything except the ability to sort of feed the presses, to feed the typesetting machines, all this sort of thing. So they wanted to find a way to get more people into this profession, and a group of these printers coalesced to form the St. Bride Foundation Institute. And this would be a school of printers located in the heart of Fleet Street. Bridewell Palace was long gone, and its location had been a prison and an orphanage, hopefully at separate times, given current politics, among other purposes. And St. Bride's Church was the traditional church of printers. De Ward is buried there. They just found his gravesite in the 20th century, so he'd been there all along. The Institute quickly raised funds around 1890. They broke ground. They opened in 1894. It's a beautiful building that is preserved and remains in place, and it featured an extensive library, practical equipment for instructions, a lecture hall, and public baths and a pool. I will get back to that because I thought it's a side note, but it is interesting. Fleet Street was a really busy place. It's a little dense, but you can see the photo at the far left. I have an arrow pointing to where Bride Lane is, where you go down there to get to St. Bride, and the church and the Institute. But there's just a lot going on. These are all photos from late 1800s to 1906. It's a busy place, full of newspaper people, busy people running around all the time, incredibly noisy because all the presses are there too. It's all where it's happening. And so as in America, when operations grew, printing presses got moved elsewhere because you needed more space. There was complaints about noise and pollution and whatever, and you needed more space for working people. So things got pushed into the suburbs, and then sometimes presses were pushed far away, and that is not a new trend. The Seattle Times moved their presses out decades ago, but that was not a new thing. This was happening, already by 1900, and this included type foundries, because type foundries were loud and noisy and had toxic metal fumes pouring out of them and what have you. So these are pictures of the Caslon factory at the left and a foundry at the right in 1902. The Caslin factory was in Chiswick Street, which is not too far from Fleet Street, from 1737 to 1937. These pictures in 1902 from a site called Spitalfields Life, which went and found these photos at the St. Bride Library. In fact, this is when in 1902 they moved the most toxic parts, the messy, noisy metal parts, off to Hackney Wick, and the packing part remained in London, or remained in the heart of London, I should say. And here is a modern picture from this year as a current map, and you can see the arrow on the upper left pointing that way, pointing to the left, is where Shoe Lane is. So that's the historic place where Winkin de Ward's offices were, and the arrow pointing down is where the St. Bride Library was and is today. Everything else at Fleet Street essentially left. Canary Wharf got filled in and buildings got built and publications moved there, or they moved elsewhere. And in 2016, the last publication that maintained any offices whatsoever relocated. The last, I think it was 2 or 3 reporters left Fleet Street. And so Fleet Street, no longer associated with printing, but there are a few memories that remain. On the left is DC Thompson's building, rather, which retains its old facade. They're based in Dundee, Scotland now, and you can see the Dundee Courier is noted there, and some other papers, if you can make the type out from that distance. And at the right is St. Bride, which endures. The school part of St. Bride moved away in 1922, but they left the library there and the pool and the baths. The library remains there today. It's endangered, which I will talk about as well. And so while Fleet Street was the heart of printing in London and in England, printing became more industrial, and that led to other parts of the country gaining footholds in the 1800s and in the early 1900s. And thus, I want to zoom out to the whole country so you can see 2 things. So there are 3 other parts of related to type that I'm going to mention, because we're going to see pieces of these in later slides. Type founding became a specialty, as I was discussing. Like, it was originally every shop did it, and then it became more and more industrialized and larger scale. So by the 1800s, most type founding was on an industrial level. You go to type factories or foundries were making these things. And while the type industry had thrived, from the 1800s on, when things failed, they failed very quickly. And 3 key larger institutions depicted on this map survived just long enough that they purchased or retained assets of everyone who'd failed before them. So they were still thriving and in business. They're like, well, we'll just take over you. We'll merge with you, Caslin Factory. And they were the last firm standing in each of the spaces. So you have I got to do my geography correctly. At the far north, York, you have DeLittle, which was a wood type manufacturer. And they were one of the largest and were the last. You have Stevenson, Blake and Company in Sheffield, which is just south of there. It's a large producer of metal foundry type, and they acquired competitor after competitor as they got bigger and bigger. And there's some great history that remains in Sheffield that I have not seen. And they also produce some wood. And Stevenson Blake is kind of a descendant of many different companies, too, as they merged together and formed new firms. And then finally, the English Monotype Company, which was created by the American Lanston Monotype as a separate entity. So the American firm sold in North America, and English Monotype sold to the entire rest of the world, England and Africa, Asia, and India. And even after Lanston failed in America, the English Monotype persisted. It persisted into the early 1990s, making equipment for metal type, for hot metal production. And their factory was in Salford's, which is, I did a little box there, so you can see where London is relation to, blow it up. London's at the top there on the right, and Salford's at the bottom. And until just a couple decades ago, they had giant factories in Salford's. Those were all torn down, and now there are like little shops and shopping center things. And Monotype has offices in London, but it also has a small office in Salford's that has archives and so forth. It's like a tiny office compared to the footprint it had before. This, I'm not going to read all this, don't worry. This is not, it's too small to read, but you can find this at the Type Archive. And again, if you want any URLs, I can give you URLs later. The typearchive.org/collections.htm. They created this incredible family tree of where they believe all of the different branches of printing, all the shops combined, and how it all merged. And then they acquired much of those 3 chains of printing of a foundry type, of individual pieces of type, of wood type, and of the English Monotype company. And so if you go visit the Type Archive, which is unfortunately not open that often, which is why I'm showing you pictures of it, because it's really cool to see what's inside this incredible place. You can see a big percentage, not of the final product. So I was at the, as were somebody else in the room, it's at the Hamilton Ways Goose. It's the wood type museum in America that's preserved a huge amount of the wood type, because Hamilton was the DeLittle, or even more so, of America. At one point, Hamilton cornered the market on wood type in America. And I was talking to the executive director there when I was at the Ways Goose is an annual printing celebration. Big conference, it was really fun. And I said, I'm going to go to London. And he said, talk to Sue Shaw, who is the person who pulled together the Type Archive. She's in her 80s. She's a force of will, a force of nature to be reckoned with. She has an iron will, and it is only through her efforts that all this stuff was saved. And he said, find out what the deal is with her wood type, because he wasn't able to get an answer about it. He knew that the DeLittle collection was there, and it turns out they have very little actual type. What they have is, in the case of DeLittle, they have templates from which wood type is made, but they don't have very much actual type that you can print with that's made from wood. And the same thing with the other parts. They have punches from which, metal punches from which you can make molds to create type, but they don't have so much type. They do have a collection of it, but it's this like one step back preservation that they've been engaged with. I'll tell you more about baby elephants. You wonder why I'm mentioning that, but I will tell you later. So those three major collections, the Stevenson Blake, the DeLittle, and the English Monotype, all wound up there. And as part of the theme for the evening, it's an existential state of despair, because who knows how long it will last, not because it will get torn down or everything will be thrown away, but in its current form, it's actually tourable, and there's a letterpress printing shop, and they can do things there, but its future is unclear as well. They just recently, last fall, they had a wonderful exhibition of Bertold Volpe's work. He's a designer from the 1930s, a type designer who later went on to do mostly illustration and calligraphy and write academically about it, teach about it. But in the 1930s and into the 40s, he created several faces, including Albertus. If you know the Prisoner TV show, that's the typeface that's used in the original Prisoner show. It's still in extensive use, and they did an exhibition of his work because they have his papers from his family, and he also did much of his work for the Monotype Corporation. And that's was one of the reasons I went to London, was to see this exhibition, and the book kind of came out of this. I thought, why not write a book since I'm there? Because as I was planning this trip to this exhibition as kind of a lark, I started finding out more and more about the state of things. And people were telling me, you need to go to the St. Bride Foundation. You need to see what's there and see its library. You need to go to the Type Archive if you can get in. So in last November, December, I was there for several days, and through lucky timing and cajoling and people being excited that someone was interested in what they were doing, I was able to get in and see these collections, which I'll be showing you next. And part of my interest now is, even though we're here in Seattle, is I want to share information about it, because I hope the more, it's one reason why I'm recording the talk, is I'm hoping the more information that's spread about these institutions, the more likely they are to survive in their current form, because they need more visibility and help. And in fact, since I gave this talk last time, both institutions are slightly more open. They have a little more going on, which is exciting if you want to go to London, and it's exciting for things being digitized and made available. So it's a moment of hope. So what I think I'm going to do at this point is, before getting into the next section where I will show you lots of the beautiful stuff inside, this is a terrible teaser. I think this may be a good time. It's about 40 minutes in. We'll take a break. All right, is everybody ready to
Oh, that is awesome.
do part 3? I swear parts 3 and 4 are much more photographic in nature.
Nice.
So where we left off, now you know everything. Now you can interpret all the images that follow. So my book includes, actually, there's some things that are not in this talk that are in my book, and that includes a fair amount about Bertold Volpe, this type designer whose work I've admired since I was in college. My senior project was actually digitizing a typeface of his. It's Albertus, that wasn't available at the time in digital form. And then I'll tell you a little bit, there's a little more Volpe in here, but the book has a chunk about him, because that was part of what brought me to London. And Albertus, along with Johnston, the typeface of the Tube, London Underground, is those two faces intersect a lot in the heart of the city. You go a little further out, and it's Gill Sands in Johnston. It's the transportation system in Eric Gill's famous face, but I've got a little bit of Gill coming up also. So let's look at some of these collections. So this is how you get to the St. Bride Foundation. You head down Bride Lane off Fleet Street. You walk past St. Bride Church, where Wynkyn de Worde and other printers are buried, and you end up at the St. Bride Foundation, dedicated in 1893 by the then Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VII. School opened in 1894. The library opened the next year, and in 1922, the school moved. The library remained, but the school moved to another part of town. And then in 1949, it moved to Elephant and Castle, which I just like saying Elephant and Castle. It's now the London College of Communication, which is part of the University of the Arts London, but it is an exact line of descent from the St. Bride Institute. So remember I said earlier there were pools and baths? It doesn't make sense when you hear about this. Like, why would you put metal type and paper and printing in a building that had pools and baths, or pool and baths? It doesn't make any sense. But the issue is, this is the late 1800s. There is no public pool and there is no public place to bathe yourself in London. So there's all these working people who come in the city. They're in flats that maybe have running water, maybe not, or there's communal whatever. They may not have any baths. So this is believed at the time, and I was reading contemporary accounts in the British printer from when this is built. These photos or these images of the plans are from a trade publication at the time. These are believed to be it was believed to be the only public pool in London at that time. And it was open, so I have people live from London here, but I think it's the core part of the city. I don't know how much of London they're calling London at that point, if it was all of Greater London, but this was the only public pool, at least in the center part, and it was open to working men and women. And at that time, of course, that's going to include people in their mid-teens. There were, in the late 1800s, you have people apprenticing in printing and typesetting who are, easily 12 or 13. The ages moved up a little bit, but it was still common. And the pool is still there, but it's covered over. It's now the Bridewell Theater. They built a platform, so the pool base is there, and they built a platform on which the seats rise. And occasionally they give tours of I forget what they call it, it's like the under theater. And they even had an art exhibit there at one point a few years ago. So it's a great little, they didn't just fill it in with cement or something. It's still there. The bones are in place. A remarkable part of the institution, due to this guy, William Blades, and this is the entrance to the Williams Blades Library inside the St. Bride Foundation. He was a successful printer in London who took up type history as a very serious hobby, and he produced exhaustive studies and notes about William Caxton's work. And I will show you a picture later of just how exhaustive. He died in 1890 at age 65, and the trustees of St. Bride, who were then just engaged in the fundraising and the other work to create this institution, they bought his library intact. But they didn't just buy his library, they bought everything, and they built the building around it, like a tomb, I guess you'd think. It's like an Egyptian concept here. So the library that I will show you later is actually his shelving and his books in place as they were in his study in his house. Because they arrived at the right time. And also, this collection of 2,000 books remains intact from 1890. And I have a story about that I'll tell you later, too, about how that was relevant to me in 2018. Hints. So here's a picture of the library. I'll show a little more later. It was restored just a few years ago. It had kind of gotten a little run down. It's 100-something years old. And it was an extraordinary collection at its time, too. There's 2 sets of keys you have to use to get through to this room, and only 2 people possess them. And I will introduce you to one of them in a moment. And the only reason I got in there is the institution or the foundation's rooms are being rented out for weddings and corporate meetings all the time. And I'm touring around with a fellow I'll introduce you to, and somebody else in the library comes and finds and says, "Bob, they're out of the library." And we go running up so we can go into this inner library, which is inside of, this is the outer library. You have to go through this to get in. So there was a meeting going on there, and they allowed us to run through while the corporate folks were off having lunch elsewhere. This is the J. Passmore Edwards collection. A fellow named Edwards donated it. He endowed a number of collections of all sorts around the country, as long as they had his name on them. So there are dozens of places you can find less precious works at the time than the Blades Library, but more necessary for studying and teaching. And then here's just, the library subscribed to journals and received donations of books and purchased books as well. So it has things like a contemporary set of the British Printer and the Inland Printer, which were trade publications that existed for decades, and they're invaluable to understand the industrial history, but also for clues about, I'll tell a story in passing, is there's a letterpress printer Laura Bentley, who's been helping at the Thornley collection in that's at help me, which PLU. They just acquired it. It's a long story there, but it's an incredible collection of ornaments and type that dates back many decades from a collector who was also ran a printing company for a long time. And Laura found an old issue of the British printer digitized that let her track down these Japanese borders because she found the same thing in a 1890 something review of material coming from Japan. And then she went to Japan on a trip she planned and was able to go to the institution that's the descendant company that has all the assets of and meet with and see some of this material and get some photocopies of things that are otherwise unavailable. So this history means something if you're in the space that tells part of a larger story. I didn't know that Japan was making and exporting metal type in the 1890s. I had no idea, and they were. And most of these, if you have a lifetime to spare, you can just go onto Google Books and peruse digitized versions of these. Sometimes when I'm doing research for a story about the era, I will wind up somehow reading a half an hour about stuff in the 1800s, and I'm like, oh, this is really not relevant. It's relevant to my interests, but not to the time I have available. So the quarters at St. Bride are very tight. They keep trying to get more space that they can rent out and less space for the library. So this is an old lecture hall. It's now full of storage. You can see the high windows in the back, and it's stacked up on the old seating is still there. And then you just pull, and this is just pages from one of the journals, pages from one of the journals that is just interesting type of the era, just stuff that's commercially available. And you can open up any book in the place and just see treasures and things of great interest. They have an extensive collection of Eric Gill's work, and I don't know the story there. I has not been able to figure out why it all wound up at St. Bride, although St. Bride was the place where if you had typographic material and no one knew where to take it, you took it to St. Bride. They said, great, we'll just find room for it, and they did. And which includes one of these things is, I promise I'll introduce this guy instead of referring to him indirectly on and on, but the fellow who's a library manager, he showed me in that room that's the lecture hall, old lecture hall. He showed me these boxes of what seemed like modern trade magazines. He said, oh yeah, there was a guy who worked in the printing industry in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and he collected like every catalog and every piece of literature at every trade show he went to, and he donated them to us. So it's an incredible historical record, but they have nowhere to put it, and it's not digitized, and it's kind of a mess, but they can't get rid of it because it would be a piece ripped out of this history that really doesn't exist anywhere else. So that is the problem they face. So this is Eric Gill in his studio. He took wax rubbings of every single thing he produced down to like house numbers he did for somebody's house. And he did, massive sculpture and designed railway typefaces, but he also did like just normal, like you could practically knock on his door and say, can we get some house numbers? And they did that scale of things too. He's a very busy man. These are drawings for Stevenson Blake and Company by Gill for a typeface called Jubilee for King George V's Silver Jubilee. It's a typeface that was released. There's a typeface called Cunard that there were drawings of that was not released. So this is just some of the examples they have. They have his original drawings and then specimens of the material that were actually printed. This is a great thing. I'm standing there talking to Bob Richardson, who I'll show you a picture of in a minute, the library manager. And he says, oh, would you like to see the original Gill Sans drawings? Well, of course I would like to see those. Thank you. And he pulls them out. And, Gill made a number of drawings, and these aren't the ones that were necessarily turned into the actual type. But these are certainly later drawings, and you can't see from where you're at probably, but he has a very peculiar little kind of sign at the end. Eric Gill kind of combined it to one mark, and that you see in all his drawings. He worked on some neon typefaces, which I knew nothing about, and so he was working on the details of how you connect the letters for neon and the interesting sketches of that. This is a fascinating overlapping drawing of Gill, and I've seen a couple explanations for it. One explanation is he may have created this for like a Christmas card that was printed, but that's in a book I will mention at the very end. That's a book about Gill and Johnston, the guy who designed the typeface that you see on London Underground and all the transport. It may also have been an exploration of the forms because he has all the angles and relationships of all these different letter forms all overlapped. And this is the famous eyeglasses G, as it's called, a lowercase g that kind of breaks with tradition. It's a geometric drawing. This is for the London and Northeastern Railway, LNER, which Gill designed. He adapted and designed type for them as well. So all right, I'm finally introducing you to Bob Richardson. Whoops. There we go. Bob Richardson, who is less grim than he looks here. He's a very delightful man, and he spent hours with me and has endured innumerable emails from me following up and beforehand. He spent 40 years as a graphic designer at the BBC and then retired, had become a letterpress printer during that time, and then retired and volunteers and is sometimes paid for his work, depending on what financial phase the St. Bride is in. And right now he is the interim library manager, and he's filling this role, and he's trying to keep things running as best he can, and he's an incredible institutional memory. He knows where everything is and what everything was. And having done additional research on things to write about, he's also completely correct about everything he knows. All checks out. So what Bob is holding here is a remarkable thing. This is called The Poisoned Sun, or The Golden Sun, and it was a newspaper printed for Queen Victoria's coronation in 1838. And a entrepreneur named Thomas de la Rue had been a printer, but he'd also made things like straw hats, and as one did in those days, lots of different businesses. And he figured out a way that you could make a gold-hued ink. And so they printed this paper in conjunction. He printed it for the Sun, and he printed this, and they sold it as a special edition. And it sold hundreds of thousands of copies at a time that thousands of copies of a paper would be more particular, and they didn't print the back side. So you're looking at the front with the portrait, the back of it is blank, so you could cut it out. And I found a contemporary account where someone is off in France, and they go to a small town, and in the library in the small town in France is a framed copy alongside precious artifacts of the city from the Sun. Now, it's called the Poisoned Newspaper because it used brass filings, and this was not handled. There was no OSHA, there was no oversight of any kind. And we know that people were made sick by this, the folks that were involved in printing it. Some dozens of people fell ill. No deaths reported we know of. We know of it because one doctor writes in letter with great detail. Again, there's no HIPAA in those times. He uses the guy's name. This young man of 17 names, so-and-so, walks in with pustules all over his private parts and goes into great depth about it to a medical journal. And he's like, well, so I went to the printing plant to find out what's going on. And they just let him in. They're like, well, no one's going to do anything to us, right? There's no concept that everyone dies who works in a printing plant. What are you talking about? And so he documented. So there's a few accounts for this one doctor, and we don't know the outcome here. But I wrote a piece for The Economist, because this is a very timely story. So 180 years, breaking news. I wrote a piece about this recently for their Prospero blog. It was had good aspects of London history and trade. So I got to see the real thing, which is fascinating. Notice Bob is holding the poisoned newspaper very gingerly. It's very old, and you wouldn't get poisoned by just touching it. You got poisoned by breathing in the fumes of brass filings. Another piece, they have a teaching collection in which a number of things live, including the Poisoned Sun. This is an issue of the Daily Mail that was produced for the blind. It's printed in Braille, and they produced it regularly for a time. It was too expensive to produce routinely, but it was an abbreviated form of the daily newspaper, printed, but also with the Braille. I mean, so you could read it if you had vision, but also in Braille. And I was told, Mark, maybe you can confirm this. I have a plant in the audience. Some products today are also printed in Braille, right? They're overprinted in Braille, in like if you buy a box of rice or something. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, but not many.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So that's still a thing. I had never heard of that being done in exactly that way before, and I'd seen this. Well, I think they only produced, I'm trying to remember the frequency. It was not produced daily in this fashion. It was an abbreviated, more like a few times a week thing, but still an unbelievable undertaking. And again, this is, I believe, can't see the date because my eyes aren't that good. It's the I think early 1900s. So you have people setting Braille by hand to print, to make an impression on it, not typing it away. So this requires some explanation. Why am I showing a picture of numbered boxes? It's because what is in these boxes is so precious, but so complicated to explain, but I will explain it. These are punches, which are engraved or carved steel. I'm going to show you in a second. And these are Caslon punches. So these come from the Caslon factory I showed earlier. So some of this material dates back hundreds of years, and it's in the collection. This is the basis of how individual pieces of type were made, whether in a foundry or otherwise. And these, so you can see, that's a close-up of just some of the punches at the left. And you say, what am I looking at here? So in order to make a piece of type from Gutenberg through the 1900s, really, if you're making individual pieces of type, artisans who worked with incredibly super sharp steel tools would carve the ends of pieces of steel punches to create letters that they then hammered into a softer matrix that was made of bronze that produced a mold. And that mold, then you poured hot metal into, and you got a piece of type that you could print from. So you can sort of see it on that illustration in the upper right. There's the punch, which is the carved letter. You pound it into a matrix. You pour lead into the matrix. You pull out that cooled lead, and you have a letter you can print from. So these punches are the origin. These are the original pieces of metal carved for the type that was used in the Caslon factories. And the reason it was hard and expensive to make type for the longest time until hot metal type came around, two reasons. I'll tell you one of them now. You can ask me the other later. Is it required a lot of artisans who are carving these tiny, tiny. It's like talk about how many angels can you carve on the head of a pin, right? This is exactly that. Is you have these almost entirely men working in kerosene lighting, if they're lucky, or they're asphyxiating from the kerosene lighting, but it's bright, and they're carving with tiny, tiny tools. They're making sometimes 4-point type. 4-point type was not atypical in the 1800s, which baffles me still. But they're making tiny type, and they're making the thing that's then pounded in, this whole process. So this is precious historical material. That still exists. And here is, earlier I showed you a picture of someone pouring hot metal into a mold. They have a huge number of hand molds. That's what that thing is called, to make an individual piece of type. They have a huge number of these at St. Bride. And here's it split apart, and it's this very complicated but also simple system. It's designed so that you lock in that matrix, that mold, you lock it into this thing, you close it up, and when you pour lead in, it fills in a very particular way. And when you pour it in, you have to pour it and give it a jerk as you do it, so it fills all the way to the bottom and doesn't leave any voids. When you crack it open, there's the piece of type that's standing like this, and then there's a piece on the bottom that gets knocked off very carefully, and then it's filed down to be perfectly even. That is where the small children came in, was filing down the type on the bottom, and I'm not kidding, sadly. Girls were better for the job, apparently, than boys who had other jobs in the factory. Fortunately, we live in the future, at least some parts of the world, I know. So this is also an extraordinary thing, which you may never have seen before, and I had never seen in person, and few people have seen in person because they only exist in a very limited form, and I didn't quite get the impact of it while I was there. These are stereotypes, which requires a little more explanation too. These are created by a gentleman named Pouchet, and a stereotype was like the metal type photocopying system of its time. So I explained how punches were made. You carve a punch, you slap, you hammer it into metal, and you have a mold that you can pour hot metal into. A stereotype, you actually would take your carved metal, like a punch-like object, or better yet, a sheet of a page of type you'd composed. So you have your page. Instead of printing from that page, you would take blotter paper and paste in a combination known as I forgot, flong is the word, flong, F-L-O-N-G, and you would use your flong brush, a special brush, and you would hammer your flong into this metal type, and it would form a reverse. It would form a paper mache mold, essentially. You'd take it, or you'd heat it, you'd take it off, then you could pour metal into the mold you'd made from the type, and you could duplicate the type you set without setting it all by hand again. So it was like a very slow photocopy machine. So what we're looking at here is Pouchet made these incredible engraved capitals, and they're incredibly beautiful. They have a huge collection of them at St. Bride. They exist almost nowhere else because Pouchet invented this technique to, he didn't invent stereotyping, but he popularized it, and other type founders were so angry at him, they essentially drove him out of business, and he made what is arguably some of the most beautiful type of the time. And so small amount of it survives, and these stereotypes are essentially duplicates of the original type that he made. And the reason they discovered they were stereotypes, they didn't know this originally when they had them at St. Bride until one of the past library managers, a man named Mosley, who occupied the position for decades, he worked in the I think it was early 1990s with a printer to print this all as a specimen book. They wanted to get a print of all of this wonderful type, and they start printing it, and they're like, it's all uneven, it's not all the same height, but type is all the same height, it has to be the same height to print. Then they realized these were all or most of them were stereotypes. They weren't intended to be printed from. They took extremely good care. They made this remarkable book, and if you can get a copy now, it's $26,000 for this collection. It's a little rare, but they have it in some rare book collections. And if you're ever in San Francisco, go to WorldCat, and you can search on Pouchet, and you can find who has a collection or has some of these. And so there's none in Seattle or Portland or everywhere else. Next time I'm in San Francisco, I'm going to, I think it's the, maybe the San Francisco State has it in their rare book collection, because I'd like to see this firsthand now that I've seen the type from which it came. This is what Bob called the ugliest type ever designed, and it's pretty ugly when you look at it. It's called a reverse contrast. So instead of having the strokes go kind of thicker this way, they go that way, and for some reason it makes us feel mad and look at it. But it dates back to the early 1800s. It seems very modern and interesting, but it actually is something they were trying that far back. So now I'm moving on to the Blades Library. In the Blades Library, here is a picture. I told you the guy took, oh, sorry, thought I went ahead. In the Blades Library. So I said that William Blades took meticulous notes about the Caxton work, and he literally wrote notes about sometimes every letter on a page and associated where they came from and the techniques and so forth. And this is one of many, many tiny volumes in which he took notes about the books that he'd acquired, these Caxton books. And they are somewhat useful if you're a historian. This is a fascinating thing. Bob pulls down a copy of, he knew just what to pull down that would get me, because the stuff that is almost impossible to find anywhere else. This is Harple's Typograph from 1870, and it's a specimen book to show you what type you should buy, right? But it's examples from many different printers. Harple had collected it, so different printers contributed different parts, or different type foundries and different printers contributed different parts to this book. The copies of it are essentially unavailable. You cannot buy one from what I can tell. But the Internet Archive has a super high resolution scan of it that is beautiful. And you go through, and again, you're like, this is 1870. How did they have the technology to print this beautifully then? Even if you don't know about printing, it doesn't match your conception of, you know, the Wild West or, you know, rough-hewn, whatever. There is incredibly fine work being done. This is a portrait of Gutenberg. I have to do like a Blade Runner enhance here, because you can sort of see it looks a little dotty, right? And here's a scan from the Internet Archive. Those are all individual pieces of type of different you know, sizes of dots. So to make this, some typesetter spent weeks or months creating essentially like a stipple picture with type. And I think it's one of the most extraordinary things I've seen. It wasn't atypical, it wasn't common, but it was a big deal for typesetters to make incredible tours de force. So this is a piece of a book by William Caxton that he printed, and you can see, you get a fairly good sense of how gorgeous it is. I try to get a close-up shot. It's just a beautiful type, beautiful printing, and this is a famous work. It's Bosius de Consolatione Philosophiae by Berthus, printed in 1478, and you can see there's a few remarkable things about it I'll highlight. One is it's got two different typefaces. It's 1478, and the guy's printing in two faces on one page. That's cool enough, because that was already hard. The other is it still has rubrication, which is where they leave space for capital letters to be illustrated by or illuminated by hand in red, hence rubrication. And it's just, you know, you can get a sense of it here. It's just an extraordinarily beautiful and incredibly intensively, perfectly printed book, and printing had just been developed. The collection also has a piece of the Book of the Dead, which is, you know, an Egyptian papyrus that survived, and somewhere in his travels, Blades apparently acquired this. No one's quite sure why, but they've got it there under glass, so you can see an extremely rare piece of that. They also have a version of the Kelmscott Press Chaucer, which was produced by William Morris, who has kind of created the arts and crafts movement. And you can see how overwrought and fancy this is, but it's also incredibly beautiful. It was a reaction to all this industrialization I'm talking about. Like, people are getting tired of that, just as in our current time. Why is Kickstarter doing so well? Why does Etsy do so well? People want some sense of authenticity. Hey, they were saying that 150 years ago. Everything's gone to machines. Everything's being produced. The quality of printing is terrible. We need to go back to our roots and understand how to make beautiful work again that has this quality of care and craftsmanship to it. And what Bob told me is this is the fancy edition they have a copy of. Blades did not buy the super fancy edition, which was much more expensive. He bought the fancy one. So many different versions. And just a piece from inside. I mean, the type, again, is a little overwrought, but it's also gorgeous, and it's gorgeously printed. And it's a classic of the arts and crafts movement. I want to tell a small story. I said before that the Blades collection of books remained intact, and this was kind of an extraordinary thing. So I have to tell the very short story version of this. This is also at The Economist. I don't know why they're buying stories from me about things that happened 150 and 200 years ago, but they are. So it's great. It's quirky stuff. So I discovered in talking to a friend of mine who's writing a book about keyboards, of course, typewriters and computer keyboards. He's got a book in progress. We're talking about typing exercises. And I remembered, oh yeah, there's exercises, there's a word for it where you can type with one hand. Like if you're a typist, try to type the word cascades or stewardesses in your mind or with your hand. Stewardesses will lock your hand up. So there are left-hand words and right-hand words. And I remembered in the back of my mind, oh yeah, I remember there being tests, like typing tests and other stuff that relied on like specific patterns. I'm like, I think typesetters used to have contests, and I find a book called The Swifts that is about typesetting races in the 1870s and 1880s. And hand typesetters setting a piece at a time, it became a thing, and they actually performed in dime museums, and hundreds or thousands of people would gather to watch people set type really, really fast. So there's one book about it, and in the book, The Swifts was written in 2003, I think. And I can't believe that it's an academic press, but I was so grateful this man wrote a book about this incredibly obscure subject that I love so much. And he mentions this book called Collation of Facts Related to Fast Typesetting is its perfect title. And I'm like, God, I really want to get a hold of it. Oh, the book, I can't buy a copy for love or money again. And I start looking around, I really want to know what's in that, because I start reading newspaper accounts at the time, researching the story, and I'm finding at the upper right, or sort of the top right, that's an advertisement that appeared in a Chicago paper of these guys. It's kind of looks like a modern version of how you would carve that, but it's really of the time. And I start digging around, and I find that the book is in the collections of a number of museums and libraries in the United States. So I start writing them, hey, would you digitize this? Would you digitize this? What could I do? And one of them says, oh, we have a rate of $1 a page. It's an 80-page book. I'm like, all right, I'm getting paid for this story. I have a Patreon that's helping me pay to write about things like this. $80 is fine, and then I'll release it into the public domain because it's from the 1870s. It's well out of it. So I go through all this, I get it, then I find out where is a copy of the book at St. Bride Printing Library, of course, because Blade had acquired the book for his collection because it's a super interesting book. And one of the guys who wrote this book is pictured, one of the people with the wonderful beards and mustaches in that photo, was probably the fastest typesetter there ever was in a competition, and the fastest there ever will be, because there will never, in any world I can imagine, be a time when people are setting type so well by hand they will do that again. But I love that kind of coming around that I was actually in the place. So the funny part is the version at the Newberry Library where they digitized it for me, they did not have the cover. It was just a generic cover. Bob Richardson at St. Bride took a picture of a few pages for me of their copy, including this beautiful, crazy cover from the 1870s that someone does an 1870 design. And I just love that someone would do something that radical, those crazy typesetters at that time. There's also a letterpress shop at St. Bride, which sounds not ironic, except that the ironic part is they didn't have letterpress equipment or any printing equipment there from about, it wasn't in 1922 when the school left, but for decades and decades, there was no printing. But in about 2010, they, like so many other places, brought letterpresses in and now have a full shop and pulled some of the stuff they had in storage, including some very ancient presses, about which there is a dispute about whether one should print on these old presses because they are old. And Bob says, if we don't print on the presses, what is the point of having them here not to show people? So they have some ancient presses that people who love this sort of thing can identify. This is Mick Clayton, and I introduced you to him. He works, he's one of the folks who volunteers and teaches, they actually teach courses, letterpress courses and do tours and so forth at St. Bride. Very nice guy. And the reason I'm showing you here is because, and he's standing, by the way, the things in front of him are stereotypes used in newspaper printing. When they created, so you would set type on a hot metal machine, they would create a stereotype of it, like this photocopy method, using blotter paper and whatever, but in a super industrial fast way. And then make metal plates that were all one piece that they could curve and run on cylindrical presses that rotated, and so you could print newspapers super fast. So they have that history there too. And two is right, it's the flong, that blotter paper material. My favorite word I learned last year. So a few years earlier, before that picture, Prince Charles visited the St. Bride Institution, which is one of the first Princes of Wales in a Prince of Wales's in a long time, and to come, and he pulled a proof, and Mick, of course, said, "Can I see your union card?" And everyone laughed, fortunately. gone through this. I won't repeat this. I used to end the first time I did this talk. I actually ended this more negatively, but because I'm worried about its survival. Not that they're going to tear the building down, although there are towers all around it, but rather that it's so expensive to run it, and the library part is the part that gets the least use. I was worried. Now, since then, I feel like I'm seeing more open dates. They have a Ways Goose, a printer celebration, just happened a few weeks ago every year, and they open the place up. They're open every other Wednesday. If you go to London and you want to see some of this, you can go in. There's a public library, but you can contact them ahead of time, and they can pull things from the stack, or you can become a member, or they may tour you around. They have letterpress classes. They're doing lectures. So there's more accessibility to this than I thought. And the biggest thing that they want to do, I think, in the future is digitize that library. And they don't have the resources to do it, but they have sometimes unique volumes of material. And so I'm less negative about that, which is good. Time has passed, and I'm less cynical about its future. So moving on. So that is the St. Bride Library. Let us talk now about the Type Archive, which is in a different part of town. It's in Lambeth, or in Stockwell in Lambeth, I should say, in the borough of Lambeth. And you may wonder why I'm showing you pictures of elephants. Well, the Type Archive is located in a former animal hospital in quarantine that, in fact, did house baby elephants. And they like to, note this fact because it's kind of fun, and they made their Type Archive logo is a little elephant. So there we go. You can find very little historically about it. There's like this one page that shows the baby elephants that you can find on one site, but otherwise not. And this is Sue Shaw, who was a longtime editor at the publisher Faber and Faber and at other publishing firms. She was a close associate and a very close friend of Bertolt Volpe and his wife and family. And she made the Type Archive happen. And I'm afraid it rests on her rather heavily. Like I say, she's in her 80s. Before I visited, I sent her email to introduce myself, and I didn't hear back. And a couple weeks later, I get an email from her saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry it took me so long to reply. I was hit by a car." There is a spirit, right, in that country. And I was like, it's really no problem. I hope you're all right. And she was. But so Sue is kind of the person that keeps this thing going. And again, it is, I worry about its future because it has so many things that are unique and important if you have an interest in type and history and the story of London and the story of industrialization. And there are museums of science there that own and have own parts of the collection. I've invested in it, but it is still a question about the future. This is Duncan Avery, who is a former Monotype employee. He began work near the end of World War II, and I thought he was in his 80s, and I think he may be a little older. I had lunch with him and a fellow named Parminder Kumar Rajput, who everyone calls Kumar, who also worked at Monotype, and the two of them came in on an off day when I happened to be there. They come in, this group of four guys, three of them in their 80s, Kumar is in his 70s. Every Monday they drive, I think it's a 140-mile round trip, and they fill orders. And you may say, orders for what? What are they filling orders for? There are still orders coming in to their almost little volunteer operation to create new type material used for Monotype hot metal systems still in use around the world. And it's tapered off a little over time, but in Africa and India especially, these systems are still in use, and they are still making new material for them. And Kumar has the singular attribute that he is apparently the only person in Monotype's history who ever learned how to use most of the machines, the manufacturing machines. There are so many of them. It was highly specialized. The factory had thousands of people working there. He learned enough of all of the machines that he can actually make new punches and new matrices that are used for the machine, the Monotype machines that then make hot metal type. So in Avery worked, he told a story about being a child and bombers crashing in the field and cabbages being blown, and then working when they converted Salford's plant, the Monotype plant, to military production during the war temporarily, and he was working there. He must have been like 15, if I'm getting his biography right, making tripods to stand up, some kind of guns. And anyway, but he was the head of the Monotype's hot metal division when the company closed the division in the 1990s, and he moved right over into this Monotype Hot Metal Limited that Sue Shaw set up in this former animal hospital. And I don't want to go into incredible depth about it, just to show some of the vast amount of material. This is a part that's used to make accented characters, and it take a half an hour to explain how it works. But it's just, they have all of this stuff. They have everything that made all the type that drove Monotype machines. They have some They have some exhibits. These were in storage because while I was there, the Bertolt Wolpe exhibit was happening. So they put some of their normal exhibition in storage. This is just showing different ways in which type was made, including the thing in the middle is stages of production in making monotype type for hot metal typesetting. It's an interesting example of sand casting, which is a common technique in a lot of artistic mediums, sculpture and so forth, that was used also to make type. And there's some suspicion, going back to Gutenberg, that Gutenberg may have used some sand casting methods before he came up with the whole metal punch thing exactly the way it was. There's a little analysis that shows that. This is Toshi Omagari, who is a type designer who works for Monotype today. And the path that took me to London was an email from Monotype saying, hey, would you be interested to know that we are about to release a set of revivals of Bertolt Wolpe's work, and would you like to talk to the designer? And I said, sure. And they said, by the way, and I wrote a story about it for a publication. They said, by the way, we have an exhibition going on in London, which I couldn't make. And then they said, by the way, the exhibition is extended, and my wife was here, said, go, you have to go. And I went. And I got to meet Toshi, spend a fair amount of time with him. He did all these revivals. And to create his revivals, he went to the type archive and pulled out Bertolt Wolpe's archives are all there, all his papers, and then all this monotype research. So he was able to work sometimes from the original material that was used to create the type in metal to recreate fresh versions in digital, because some of Wolpe's work had never been digitized, and some of it had gone through iterations in phototype and had lost the quality, or it was being created in such a literal fashion that they were creating digital versions that were really meant to be printed in metal. So it doesn't work. You print something on an offset press, the ink spreads and works in a different way than with contact. So Toshi, wonderful guy, and he's pulling out some of the little patterns I was mentioning earlier. These are wood patterns that were then traced on the machine at the right, a pantograph. You put the pattern down, you lock it in place, you have a block of wood, and you have a motorized cutting thing with those two arms are linked together, and you can make type larger or smaller. You trace with the one arm the pattern, and it's mechanically converted to larger or smaller size as you cut away the wood that you're actually going to turn into wood type. And I saw this also, a very different system at the Hamilton Wood Type Museum, because these were all essentially created in-house, and this was the little system. And here is not Mr. DeLittle, but Mr. DeLittle's grandson. I guess that's one of those old jokes, who's bigger, Mr. Big or Mr. Bigger's son, I don't know, whatever, but it's a little bigger, he's DeLittle. This is the grandson, and he continued to make type on his own until I think it was the 1980s, just in a workshop, just with the stuff he had. He was the last man standing, and he just made wood type for the printers that existed, and Sue Shaw acquired that collection for the archive. Just more pieces of the, these were type that was shipped all over the world. These are typefaces used in India and Sinhalese at the bottom there, other faces. This is the very first Monotype keyboard. I don't mean the first version. I mean, this is literally the very first Monotype keyboard. They have it because it came from Monotype. And you can see this. This is, there was no model for a typewriter because typewriters were new too. Typewriters and typesetting machines co-evolved, and there's some interesting connections that, again, I could do another 2 hours on. I'm not going to treat you to, don't worry. But there's a, if you look very closely at this, which you can't see there's no QWERTY yet. The keys are not in any standard alignment, but within a few years, Monotype goes with QWERTY, and they look like a typewriter, and so it's easy for people who are typists to move back and forth. Linotype, which was the first hot metal system and Monotype's big competitor, they went with Etowin Shrdlu, which is Etaion Shrdlu, the 12 most common letters in the English language. And so they had stripes. You could stripe down those character frequencies so you type them most often. And so a linotype operator could not switch back and forth with what it became a standard for typewriting or for monotype. Some of that's proprietary, like they're trying to keep people in their system, and some of it's just what it was. Very quick sidebar on Monotype. So Monotype is one of the first cases of this abstraction between a thing that you input data into and a thing that does a thing for you. So already at this time you had Jacquard punch cards that drove looms that were mechanical, but they were punch cards, and you feed them in, and you can still see them in use today, and they would drive a mechanical loom by levers pushing through holes in the card and the cards being moved along, and you had punch cards being used for the US Census. This is paper tape on a reel, and as you typed on a Monotype keyboard, on a Linotype as you typed, and metal matrices flew down and lead is being shot out, like literally right here. I mean, I'm sitting here typing and the lead is squirting out right here. And if you're not careful and you're not listening and you hear that it's about to squirt out at you, you can get burned, right? Monotype, much more civilized. I have a keyboard, I have the paper tape. I sit there in my white sleeves, shirt and type away. And then you take the paper tape over to another machine and you play it back like a player piano and it produces the type. So this is a very early example of abstraction of concept. And this is one of the machines. This was to set display or larger size type, but it has the same thing. It has a paper tape reel, that sort of blue thing in the center that you feed through and it goes through and it is pneumatic. It pushed air through and the air pushing through caused different things to move. It is the most Rube Goldberg-y or Heath Robinson, if you're from the UK or Australia, system. Monotype made everything in-house, including the wrenches. I don't think you can see them, unfortunately. I included all those wrenches are stamped Monotype. They had a big factory, and all of this remains, as I say. This is Toshi holding a piece of, it's a matrix used to cast hot metal type, and this is an Albertus letter. I have to reverse it in my head. It's a P, I believe, and this is to cast large amounts of display type. So even when newspapers and books were being set by someone sitting at a keyboard, and it was being produced in massive like columns and so forth as pages or columns for a newspaper, you still had people setting display or larger type sizes, 72 point and above, sometimes even smaller, by hand because you had to arrange it by hand. The machines didn't let you set, you could, eventually things like that came out, but you weren't setting giant pieces of type in giant forms. So the lead was too heavy, it was too bulky. I'll show you another picture of that in a moment. Here's just oops, pointing the wrong direction. This is just a bunch of Albertus that's coming off that machine I showed you a moment ago. They're just running out type. So they have many letters, many of the same letters produced, and each of these is an individual piece of metal that's produced in a hot metal system through an automated machine. Someone asked me, Jill, I even know your name, because I know, a friend told me you're coming. So Jill asked earlier, was there a specialized profession that brought type from type places to printers, which is a great question because there certainly were in some places there are specialized transportation. In type, no, but this is an interesting side case. These boxes were meant to be shipped by railway, and what it was is it's Monotype's lending library. So if you own Monotype casting equipment, you could rent, I think it was £5 or something. You pay Monotype £5, and they would take a set of type. You wanted a bunch of Albertus or Gil Sans or whatever. They'd take one of these boxes, they'd stick your name on it, they would hand it to the railway, and the railway would deliver it to you. And it's all screwed shut and whatever, and you'd use one of those machines to make as much type as you could in a week, and then you'd screw it back together, and you'd send it back to Monotype. And I just love that. It just seems very British to send stuff by rail like that. They'll send you your Gil Sans by rail. Just some other, this even has the Lanston name on it. It's the American version of the company. Just some other ancient, what's the date on that one? I think that says 1887 is one of the patents, but I think that's a very early Monotype machine. This is called a Cowper's Parlor printing press, and it's a little hard to make out what's going on here. I put a few different pictures of it. It's a compact thing about this big, because you know what the most fun you could do in the late 1800s is you could do letterpress printing in your house with a little compact press, and there are still versions of this today, but the thing was designed literally just to use in your parlor. It was a parlor press, and I thought, and Sue Shaw told me about this, and she said, oh, the one that looks so shiny, she actually had made for her, but she had some original ones from the 1800s that are in the collection. And I don't think about this for a while, and I'm doing some research for a story, and I find that someone wrote a book about printing presses in the 19th century. Of course, I buy a copy of it, because I'm me. And it is full of parlor printing presses. This was a thing. There were like dozens and dozens of models of presses intended use as for fun in the house. And, Viz, there you go. What are you going to do in the evening? Your father's reading the newspaper, and with your lovely bride or with your lovely husband, you're setting type in the corner and printing things in your home, calling cards and stationery and birthday invitations. I can't even get over that concept that was a thing. This is a sea of equipment at the Type Archive. It's all Monotype casting equipment that Sue would love to find a home for. There are people who are still, in America and England and elsewhere, not just places that never retired their equipment, who are still producing hot metal type because there are still letterpress printers out there. And I'm not getting into this deeply in this talk, but the foundry type, the type that was made of hardened metal, one at a time in factories, that's burning away. Not only was it thrown out, but when you use it, it accumulates wear. And so eventually, if no new type is being produced, there will be no type to print from. There's a few ways around that, but one of them is there are people running old hot metal equipment, keeping it alive, and producing new type for today's letterpress printers. Although it's a relatively small set compared to what was available in the past. Just a fascinating little side note in history too is this is a Macintosh-driven Monotype casting system, and this is a pneumatic simulator essentially to blow air in the way. So instead of feeding paper tape through, this thing connects to a Monotype caster, and it blows air through as if paper tape's going through. So you can set type on your Macintosh, hit a button, and produce metal type. It's not really that easy, but it sounds that easy. There's a movie called Pressing On that premiered last year that shows a lot of casting that's going on and fellows who collected, almost all men who collected, and they're teaching. It's almost all men teaching mostly, but not entirely women in the current generation. And they have a lot of casting gear, and one of those machines, you can see it in use in that movie. It's just some, again, more type from, I'm going into too much detail if I even tell you. It's just parts of the collection. Devangari here, patterns for doing large type. These are the patterns that would be traced on a more modern kind of pantograph system to carve metal type from which the molds are made for casting on a monotype. Interesting side note, just in terms of all the history that's there, is they have all of Monotype's records, so they don't have all the type drawings necessarily, but this is just file after file of custom ornaments and custom type made for Monotype clients, including copyright notices and what it was used for. So if you needed special characters for your particular clients or study needs, you could get them. Monotype also had a phototype era, but instead of creating something entirely new, they used their existing metal case and put phototype in it. So you can't exactly see, but that's phototype, and it's a wacky thing that did not last very long. But it's that kind of thing. Is when disruption comes to an industry, people cling on for dear life. This is why Intel has had trouble right now, is they don't have mobile processors. Monotype didn't have a real phototype system. The world keeps spinning around. And I'm just going to page through a few. This is just endless amounts of material in there, row after row of cases. Just keep opening things up. It's like a candy shop. If you like eating type, I guess. And this finally, I'm showing you a bunch of boxes. How fascinating. This is Bertold Volpe's. These are his papers, which Volpe was born in 1905. He died in 1989, and he had children sort of late in life. And what I didn't know until this exhibit opened is that he had 4 children, he and his wife. His wife passed away in the early 2000s. All 4 of the children are still alive, and they're in their 60s and 70s. And one of the older ones, Paul, has been, even though his father died now almost 40 years ago, or no, sorry, 30 years ago, Paul retired as a doctor a couple years ago, and he's finally going through and cataloging. His father collected so much material and occupies many, many shelves in the type archive. And they include things like this. Is a friend of Volpe's drew a picture of his on a door, and the door is in the archive because, and that Toshi Omagari, who introduced you to before on the left, the person who did the Volpe type revivals. On the right is Toby Volpe, who was the youngest of the kids, who turns out I start corresponding with on Twitter when I discover he's alive, that he exists, and he is a technology editor for ZDNet in Europe. Of course, we have the same profession, and so I got to meet him. He came out, and he lives in Sussex, came in. He'd been at the exhibit frequently. Toshi practically lived there. That's a photo of the Volpe exhibit, beautifully staged in that room that Monotype underwrote. And there I am. We're all off to go to a pub, I think, Sue and Toshi and I. So trying to give you a run through this so you can kind of understand where what happened in London, because you think of London when you hear about it, you read stories about it. London was full of type, it was full of printing, and it all disappeared. And we understand this in Seattle because all of our heavy industry has disappeared here too. It's all moved out to the suburbs. I was driving by, I've forgotten the name of the storage place that's down in right near the Museum of History and Industry. what's the that was the
Craftsman Press.
yeah, Craftsman Press, right? The last large printer in Seattle, and that was what, 25 years ago, right? They moved out to the suburbs, and now it's a storage unit. And oh my God, is the type on that terrible? I'd never noticed how awful it was. The sign that says it. And this is true in London as well, but to a greater extent, it's a much bigger area and things pushed off. And so, you know, I'm not in the book. You meet other people. I've met with some letterpress printers like Phil Abel, who's a lovely guy and doing some really interesting modern work, including printing replicas of record albums. Almost, he's working with a firm that's making limited repressings of LPs, and they hired him to essentially reproduce in letterpress some of these original, you know, 1940s, 50s records. So it's this complete, authentic feeling experience. And he's printing, you know, classic jazz and classical work in the same equipment that it would have been printed in using Monotype to typeset the actual text for it. He had a full Monotype hot metal system until a few years ago. A couple years ago, he had a move, second move in 7 years, to a smaller place, and he got rid of it all, but he didn't throw it away. There's a young fellow who was apprenticing with it. He moved up to York. I showed you how far. If you don't know where England's geography, York is way up there, and York is full of letterpress people because it's apparently affordable, although I think Yorkshire is getting less so now is what people are saying. But there's hot metal that's moved out of London and north, and those letterpress printers have moved to where they have room, so it hasn't all disappeared. There are a couple young guys I'm forgetting what city they're in, but it's the northwest of London, and they're producing a regular publication all set in hot metal or other you know, engravings and things like that, and it's a really remarkable printed publication. So there's still work going on there, and you know, it sounds like a public awareness campaign. I'm not going to now put up my hat and say, please give freely to St. Bride and Type Archive, but I feel like I want to pass along some of this information, both like what's inside these collections, these remarkable pieces of history that are so hard to obtain, and I was given a look into, but also to know that these resources exist if you're interested in research or understanding it, that they're there. And like St. Bride, Type Archive used to be barely accessible. It really had almost no public hours or whatever. It sounds like they are doing more. There was a recent rare book festival around London, and they were open for a day, and you could go and tour the archives and do a letterpress class. They have another event coming up, and I'm hoping that they are become more accessible too. So if you travel to London, you might actually be able to get into this and see some of these extraordinary things. So the very last part, and then questions, or I will release everyone who is exhausted from all this material. Part 5, places to visit, just a little bit. This is kind of a very rough map of London showing the lay of a few things, but that, I remember what they are. What is that from? Yeah, so you've got, oh, I know, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide. On my side. St. Bride Library is just off Fleet Street. They're open every other Wednesday. And as I said, there's a lot more things going on there. The Type Archive has an exhibition right now, again, for a few weeks of an illustrator's work, who I happen to know bought a copy of my book because I recognized his name. So that's sort of snaking in the tail. I don't know what it is. But they have more things going on as well. And they're all the way in the south there. It seems like it's very far away, but it's not. You can just take a tube there, take the tube there. The London Transport Museum is fascinating because they, two reasons. One is, I'm not even getting into in this talk, I may do a talk later this year about Johnston and the typefaces of the tube and London Transport. London Transport has an entire, I mean, it's an interesting place. It's geared sort of towards kids. The museum is right at Covent Garden. All right, good, all right. I love it. I go, every time I'm there, I go. It's got it's got kid exhibits, but then it's also got all these vehicles and everything else. It has one room that's like a design room that is full of some of, you know, replicas or the original drawings of the type and of posters and showing the history of the place. It's wonderful. I'm dragging my family to something else that I just found out about preparing this talk. The London Transport Museum has a museum depot in Acton, which is a bit west of Kensington, and they're barely open. They're open like twice a year to the general admission, but they do tours and special events. And I'm looking this over, and they have something called Johnston Journeys, and it's a typographic tour, a 90-minute tour that my poor children will be enduring. It's only 10 pounds. Kids, you'll love it. Yeah, so we're gonna go on that, and I'm sure it. It's the museum depot is a like rolling stock and other stuff and huge amounts of signage. There's letterpress equipment there. I've seen pictures from people who've gone on tour, and I thought, well, it's only open twice a year. It's not open while I'm there, but this tour will take you through the signage. They're doing the Johnston tour a few times. There's other tours of it as well. So if you like that kind of thing, which you may because you're here, the Postal Museum also is even more like, I'd say, canted towards children, but it's got a lot of really interesting typographic pieces in it, and it's not too far from Pancras Station, St. Pancras. And you can ride a postal train. They've converted, there were automated trains under London that move the mail around, and you can ride on a piece of that they've preserved, which is terrifying and cool. Maybe for children, but the children were not that terrified. I was more terrified than they were. The London Center for Book Arts is in the far upper right there. I didn't get to go there, but that's apparently, they have classes, exhibitions, a shop, and do some really interesting work. There's the Design Museum I didn't get to see on this last trip. Victoria and Albert has a variety of different work that is sort of fits into the graphic, design, but also printed thing. The Cartoon Museum I didn't get to either, the Museum of Brands. And here's something I found that it's too far from London unless there's something specific going on. It's called Snape Maltings, which I challenge you to find another thing that sounds more English than Snape Maltings. And it's a converted malting factory in Snape, and it's about 3 hours east of London. And they hosted another Volpe exhibit in conjunction with a book that was put out, and they teach stone carvers there in an apprentice program. So if you happen to be on the eastern coast of England and you go through Snape, they have all this work. Everyone who graduates from the program, the apprenticeship has to produce a piece that is there. And so over time, they've been doing this now for, I think it's going on 20 years, and really lovely people. They have a few copies of the book there when they had the Volpe exhibit. In the Coles to Newcastle story, I will say I just last week got books into London, so the book is actually available for purchase at Magma Books in London, which made me delighted, because how can I write a book about London and type and it's not actually in London? The one last thing is, and again, I can send if people want, to email. There's a few books that I think are great reading. Johnston and Gill by Mark Ovenden, who's written a lot about transport maps of the world. It's a really in-depth look at the two men, Edward Johnston and Eric Gill, and their lives are very intermingled. It does not deal with, if you know anything about Eric Gill, he committed some horrible acts in his life, which were not discovered until decades later, and it does not deal with that revelation at all, which I found a little disappointing, but the part about type is really good. And it's a really good book. I wish it had addressed it a little more thoroughly. And it's, it's not available to U.S. trade, so they couldn't order it here when I talked about getting it in, but it's, I think, $45 at various places online. The Total Man by Phil Cleaver was an interesting book about Bertold Volpe it's beautiful, and it is available from the lettering, what is it called? The Lettering Arts Trust in Snape Maltings. The History of the Monotype Corporation. I don't know that if anyone else in the world has as much interest in this as I do, but that's a book that came out a few years ago that has massive information. A Short History of the Printed Word. If you're interested in the multi-century history of printing at a slower pace than I just zipped through it here, it's a great book. It's out of print. And Bertold Volpe, a retrospective survey, if you're interested in his work, a survey of his work. There's an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1980, and there's a catalog published that year, which is available, and then a reprint that Sue Shaw arranged in 2005 that's quite nice and is much less expensive to obtain used as well. There's at least one copy in this bookstore of a book called The Visual History of Type, which you could kill someone with. It is 8 pounds, 8 avoirdupois pounds. Like, it weighs 8 pounds in weight, sorry. And it's, I think, $80, $85, and it is 600 pages of beautiful, large, reproduced specimens of type, tracking the entire history from Gutenberg Bible, or well, before that even, to practically when the book was finished a couple years ago. And a huge percentage of the specimen pages that show these examples of type came from the St. Bride Library, of course. And just one last slide. Doing the most English things I could possibly do while I was there, drinking Guinness in a pub and having afternoon tea in St. Pancras Station at Fortnum and Mason. Thought I would just do both of those things. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for coming to this thing. And